94.4 in Nairobi, Mombasa 87.9, 102.5 in Kisumu, Nakuru 96.0, 96.7 in Eldoret, Nyeri 90.9, Malindi 97.7. We broadcast to the world as well on www.spicefm.co.ke, as well as Spice FM KE on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. For the next 2 hours, we are also live on KTN Home. I'd like to welcome our audience on KTN Home. Today, 27th of August, 2020, we are having a conversation around the Constitution of Kenya 2010, but also just starting from the entire journey towards that Constitution and then the journey since 2010. Right? So we'll be beginning from having a conversation around how this journey came about, how we got to a point where we had the Bombers Constitutional Conference, the Bombers draft, much contentious Bombers draft. Then we had the Kilifi draft. Then we had the Constitution referendum in 2005, and the new push to have a new constitution beginning in 2008, again, up to 2010. We'll be speaking to P.L.O. Lumumba. Professor P.L.O. Lumumba is a former Constitution of Kenya Review Commission Secretary and CEO, and therefore he was also the Chief Rapporteur of the Bombers Constitutional Conference. Professor Lumumba will be telling us about that journey up to that point, what the CKRC did. This is the Yashpal Gai Constitution Commission, which had brought in together even members from, remember the whole journey of forming the CKRC. First of all, President Daniel Arap Moi appoints this commission, and then there's a parallel move that's happening outside Parliament, led by the civil society and religious organizations and the opposition parties in Parliament. Some of them also joined this. It was called the Fungamano Initiative. Professor Yashpal Gai was like, all right, now let's find a way of bringing all these together so that we can together look at how to review the Constitution. That will be a journey. So 7 to 8 now, we'll be talking to Professor Lumumba. Then from 8 o'clock, we'll speak to Martha Karua. Remember, Martha Karua was the Justice Minister since 2006 to 2009. It's important to note that in 2006, when she took over, this was when President Mwai Kibaki had also had to reorganize his government after the referendum of 2005, where people who were allied to the president were championing the yes vote, and those who were allied to the then roads minister were championing the no vote. ODM was born in that whole drama.
In that maternity.
In that maternity, ODM was born. So Martha Karua became Justice Minister, and she was also very much involved in the new push for the new constitution. Remember the church also? We discussed about the churches. So the church was very much involved, and since then even the church has been, not just the church, but religious leaders have been very much instrumental in getting us to where we are right now. At 9 o'clock, we'll be speaking to Archbishop Martin Kivuva of the Catholic Archdiocese of Mombasa. And yesterday, as religious leaders, they came together and they issued a statement giving us scorecard on the Constitution implementation process, what the Constitution has delivered for us. We'll be discussing with him on that. Packed show, so keep it right here on Spice FM. Let's start from the beginning. This clamor for a new constitution, going back into the late 80s, into the repealing of Section 2A, into having new multi-party elections and having multi-party in the country, coming up to the IPPG of 1997, where now it was about electoral reforms. It was all a journey that had begun, and the clamor to have a new constitution was, like you say, building up speed.
That journey hasn't actually stopped. With every era, it gathers momentum, and it comes with new demands.
Yep.
But even at independence and immediately after, there were issues about the Constitution. There have always been issues about the Constitution.
Yep.
Multipartism would never have been a discussion if we ourselves hadn't clawed back time and gone back to a one-party state. But the reality was there we were, so we needed to get back to where we had been previously.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing about freedom is you get freedom and you understand just the scope that is available to you, you then demand more.
Yeah.
Yes. And it was perceived that so long as we had this constitution that we had from independence, nothing was ever really going to change fundamentally. Nothing. So the understanding was, let's get a new constitution.
With the formation of the Yashpal Gai Commission, I think there was now this kind of feeling around the country that finally we are on the road and the path towards attaining a new constitution.
Yes, and something that we are the ones who have crafted as
We are
opposed to something which was
participating in.
handed over to us. And why Yashpal Gai? Because he's one of Kenya's most renowned sons. When you talk about constitutions around the world, whether it is South Africa, whether it is in the Far East, there are very few people who I think have participated in the formation and the drafting and creating of constitutions on this planet as much as Yashpal Gai. He was eminent, he was known, and at that point in time, he was acceptable.
So it was masterstroke for Moi to actually get in and appoint and accept to appoint Yashpal Gai.
Yes.
And also good for Yashpal Gai to come in and say, no, let's bring everybody on board. Let's bring the Fungamano side also. Let's bring everybody on board so we can have this journey going together. So they went around the country collecting views. And we want now to talk to Professor P.L.O. Lumumba to hear when they were going around the country, the views that they were collecting. They came up with the CKRC report, went to the Bomas of Kenya. There was an entire constitutional conference in Bomas, brought in delegates from around the country. I mean, we were moving on very, very well until we weren't. Professor P.L.O. Lumumba, good morning.
Yeah, good morning.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning and welcome to the Situation Room. In the room, you have me, Eric Latif, Ndu Oko, and C.T. Muga.
Yes.
So, Prof, let's look back at the journey and the time for CKRC and the work that the CKRC did. And just like you've heard us introduce, this was a time when people felt around the country that finally we have a journey that we are all participating in writing a new constitution. And when the CKRC was going around the country, just take us through what the kind of vibe that you were getting around the country at the time.
Let me begin my conversation from the CKRC. One could have gone a little bit earlier, but I'll not do that. I begin at a time when the two parallel processes have been put together under the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission Act, Chapter 3A of the Laws of Kenya. And our mandate was first to identify what it is that Kenyans wanted. And if you look at our records and in the archives, you'll be able to see the kind of question that we posed. Kenyans had indicated that they wanted a new dispensation, and therefore we had to interpret that. That was the first act of the CKRC. What do Kenyans want? And we did indicate, number one, that Kenyans wanted a good Bill of Rights. Kenyans wanted the question of land dealt with. Kenyans wanted representation to be improved. Kenyans wanted a government that was not too centralized. Kenyans wanted the marginalized community to be mainstreamed. And they wanted a chief executive who was not overbearing, having come from an administration of Jomo Kenyatta and Daniel Arap Moi, who were imperial presidents. And therefore, we simplified the issue and visited the then 210 constituencies, apart from other engagements which we had with specialized groups. And of course, we were doing this at a time when there was great reluctance on the part of President Moi, because President Moi did not believe that you needed a new constitutional dispensation. And that was not only President Moi. There were individuals within his administration who did not believe, even the younger ones. I remember debating Julius Sunkuli, who was then a far powerful minister in the Moi administration. He did not believe that we needed a new constitution of dispensation. Even the current deputy president did not believe so, and quite a number of them. But ultimately, we collected the views of the people of Kenya, interpreted them, and delivered a constitution and a report. In fact, commentators will tell you that there is not a process of constitution making in modern constitution making that has been documented like the Kenyan constitution under the CKRC. So what did we do? The Kenyans told us we want a president who is not overbearing. Therefore, we made recommendations, which we borrowed quite a bit also from what the people told us, and benchmarked. We said, let us have a president and a deputy president and a prime minister who will be present in parliament. Let us have ministers and let us have them in a limited number. We looked at the question of land and we knew that there were historical injustices. There were people like the Ogiek, people like the Nubians in Kibra, people like the Wata, people like the Dashnach. We made recommendations relating to land, and that is the genesis of the National Land Commission. The Bill of Rights, we said we ought to improve it, and we improved it in a manner that was then corresponding with the UDHR of 1948 and the Charter of the UN of 1945 and the African Convention on People's Rights. And we have a very good Bill of Rights. We then went into the area of representation. And this is the area where we said, how do we deal with women who are historically marginalized? We recommended proportional representation and told Parliament then, don't increase constituencies from 210 to the 290. They did not listen to us. We then, of course, looked at devolution and recognized that we did not want to go full hog federal or confederal. We simply wanted to devolve so that financial semi-autonomy is enjoyed by the region. But we said we don't want devolved units, and Kenyans told us we don't want devolved units which are ethnically pure, and we want them viable. We recommended 14 regions. The parliamentarians later gave us 47, which are troublesome. The judiciary, we wanted an independent judiciary. And of course, we created and expanded the JSC and constitution. Of course, we also looked at ethics and corruption, and we recommended that we have a body, we have an ombudsman, and all those things are there in the constitution. It is that report that became the basis of discussion at the Bomas of Kenya, which we convened on the 27th day of October, the year 2002. And I remember sitting at the headquarters of the CKRC at KCB building at about 2 a.m. in the night when the draft had not been released. And I hear it being reported, President Moi saying, hiyo katiba ni mbaya inasema wanaume waoe wanaume. Of course, it was completely untrue. And President Moi then refused to give his views on the ground that we're requesting his views was an afterthought.
Yeah.
And he had a master stroke. He then, knowing that members of parliament would be the delegates, and knowing that we had convened at the Bomas of Kenya, what he did was to dissolve parliament on the 27th day of October. And when he dissolved parliament, we had hired police officers to guard us there. I went there myself as the secretary, and on the 28th, the police barred me from entering the place. And the following day, Swiswila Amos Wako, who was the Attorney General of the Republic, issued a long statement, which was self-serving, saying that we could not now have a conference because
don't have delegates.
there were no delegates.
Of course.
And they said, but the government was still committed to the entire process. We had even attempted at that time to extend the life of Parliament. We suggested that the life of Parliament be extended because that was indeed a constitutional moment. But the opposition at that time, led by Mwai Kibaki and Raila Odinga, said not even a day more because they thought they would win the elections. And of course, ultimately,
they won the election.
Quickly put together a NAC, then campaigned on the basis that they would deliver the constitution within 100 days.
Just to hold you there, for a bit, you've mentioned something that is important here. So you went around the country, 210 constituencies, picked views from everybody but the president. Why?
Yeah, correct. The president refused.
Also, you approached him and he said, I'm not going to give my views because you're suggesting that men should marry men. This is the way
it happened, and I've written a book about it. First of all, we of course went through the usual protocol, and the president was in Mombasa, and we said that we would take his views from Mombasa. Then he sent word that because we had taken him for granted and we were collecting his views at the last minute, he would not give his views. But remember that KANU, as a party, had given its views. So when he said that, of course, we did not worry. And during that process, we are also fighting other battles. There were court cases. The judges, led by Bernard Chunga, the Chief Justice, had himself sued us, and we were cited for contempt, and we were meant to go to jail. But I think the environment was such that You couldn't jail us. And we said we were prepared to go to jail. So many things will happen. But to answer your question directly, President Moi refused to give his views.
Let's now fast track then to the elections happened in December 2002. We have a new government coming into office, and President Mwai Kibaki, when he was being sworn in at Uhuru Park, he promises that he's going to deliver the constitution within 100 days.
Oh, yes, he
and
did.
then, so from this point, then with the new administration, the Bomas conference had to be reconvened, or let's just say to be reconvened. But the first initial time, the delegates were only going to be members of parliament. At what point did this change to include other delegates?
That is not correct. The delegates were going to be drawn from different sectors of the society, but the bulk of them were parliamentarians.
Well, 210 MPs.
210 of them. But all sectors were to be represented, 629 delegates.
Okay. Did you notice that there was a change by the time you were convening now the Bomas conference under the NAC administration?
Oh, yeah, of course. John Njoroge Mishuki was very explicit. He told us that, in fact, we never wanted a new constitution. We just wanted to remove Moi. That is what John Njoroge Mishuki said. We never wanted a new constitution. We simply wanted to remove Moi. Now that he is not there, why should we even bother about a new constitution?
Well, how did you feel about that, if I can ask, based on the work that had been? I mean, did it give an indication of what others may have been feeling vis-a-vis what Kenyans felt?
Oh, the political class, particularly the ones who had now won the election, were quite comfortable with that old constitution. It was very annoying, and I think our anger was expressed very, very clearly, and there was indeed an apparent attempt to scuttle the process. So that you can see when we convened at Bomas, it was on the 30th day of April, the year 2003. We had wanted to convene in the month of January, but there was stalling and there was a lot of pushing and pulling and pushing. We were being starved of funds and many things were happening. Our own commissioners, some elements within the commission were already recruited by the new administration. I'll not name them, but I've named them in my book. Some of them are senior government officials now, but they have been recruited by the new administration. The then Minister for Justice, who is now the governor of Meru, Murungi Kiraitu, was very active in this regard in trying to ensure that there were recruits within our ranks. So there was division even within the commission at that time.
Professor Lumumba, Professor, are you saying that what was then voiced by Mr. John Mishuki was genuinely representative of the views of those who are in power?
Oh, yeah, some of them.
Do we have examples of people who perhaps didn't share that view?
Oh, there were quite a number. At least remember that the NAC group was also put together very quickly so that it was a marriage of convenience. There were those who took the view that we needed a new constitutional order, those who are in the church and the civil society. In the political class, people like Raila Odinga took the view that we needed a new constitution. Kalonzo Musyoka was not quite clear, said one thing one day, another the same day, but I'm sure he'll say that he wanted a new constitutional order. So there were those within the political class who wanted a new constitutional dispensation, but there were those, particularly those allied to President Mwai Kibaki. They were clear. Christopher Murungaru, but it was quite clear that you did not need a new constitution, and quite a number of them.
You know, we're going into a break, but I want to ask this question, which you can answer after the break. Can we then say that what you've just described actually never went away? That even now, many of the problems we have that relate to the Constitution are like a carryover from the situation that you've just described?
Oh, that is correct. And I'll answer it properly.
Broadcasting every weekday morning, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. This is Kenya's only morning talk show that looks at matters that affect you from a local perspective, regional and international perspective. In the room this morning is Eric Latif, Ndu Oko, C.T. Muga. Joining us on the line is Professor P.L.O. Lumumba. And P.L.O. Lumumba was the Secretary and CEO of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission. We were talking about the journey to towards the new constitution. And CT, before we went to the break, you asked the professor a question.
And he actually responded in a word, yes. But where I was going with the question was actually this. If those who are now in power, the president as his deputy, represent the views of those who perhaps, maybe partially, who are not for the constitution, how really can we expect that this constitution will actually achieve what was intended to achieve?
The line is not as clear as it should be. I hope you'll hear me.
We hear you.
It must be understood that there are quite a number of people, not very many, but quite a number of people, even within the current administration, who are reluctant Democrats. and they are sitting at the table of constitutional implementation, not because they are enthusiastic about it, but because they are compelled. And it's therefore important to note, particularly when you see is the epic fights about devolution. There are people who still believe that the more centralized the government, the more powerful they are, the more they control the knife and the yam, the more it is good for them in terms of wielding power. And that is why you see that implementation of the Constitution has not been done in a very enthusiastic manner. And there are also bureaucrats within government, not only politicians. Bureaucrats, look at the entire provincial administration as you knew it. One of the things we said in the Constitution is that we should scrap provincial administration. It is still alive and well in all its splendor through county commissioners. So they undermine sometimes the implementation process in the area of devolution. I think that is part of the problem that we have in this Constitution. We have people who came out of Egypt, but Egypt still dwells in them.
We're at a time where now amendments are being spoken of on one side. And on the other side, there's the call to say, many parts of this Constitution have not been implemented, just as you've given, way to now. What is your thought on that? Already go ahead and amend something that has not been lived out throughout all its elements and factors? What are your thoughts about that?
First of all, let us understand that the Constitution that we ended up with, the 2010 Constitution, was a Constitution that came after the 2007-2008 post-electoral violence. And this Constitution was in many ways a ceasefire document between the elements led by Mr. Raila Odinga and then President Kibaki. So there are elements within that Constitution which were introduced. For example, I've never understood why we ended up with 47 counties. I've never understood how we ended up with a presidential system. I've never understood how we created a Senate, which is not an upper house. I've never understood why you say that there should be 1/3 representation of women, yet the architecture of the Constitution does not allow it. There are many things that you find in that Constitution, and I heard it being said by those who are leading the Yes campaign, that let's just accept this Constitution, we'll deal with the problems a little later. So there is a sense in which there are things within the Constitution that require cleaning up. But that is not to take away the fact that it ought to have been implemented a lot more robustly, and that it ought, therefore, to have had greater impact. But to answer your question directly, after the 2017 election again, remember after the handshake between President Kibaki and Mr. Raila Odinga, and remember Mr. Raila Odinga he had a handshake with Moi, he had a handshake with Kibaki, and now the handshake with Mr. Uhuru, President Uhuru Kenyatta. And there are people who say, and I agree with them to a certain extent, that the BBI was an afterthought, essentially a Trojan horse by Mr. Odinga and his acolytes to get into power. I don't buy into that. I think that the BBI, whether it's an afterthought or a Trojan horse, gives us an opportunity to examine some of the elements in the Constitution that need attention. That, I think, is a legitimate thing. So while there are things that are implementable, there are things that are not implementable because of the architecture of the Constitution. Look at the spat about revenue allocation. It is simply because the relationship between the House the National Assembly and the Senate and the Commission of Revenue Allocation is not clear. But if there was clarity, we would not have this kind of conflict. So there is reason to examine the current constitution. And people do not know. In the year 2016, the government did order or instruct the then Auditor General, Mr. Eddie Uko, to audit the constitution. And there is a whole report that talks about that audit. I remember participating in that audit as a consultant with my friend David Lee. And there are many recommendations that were made. Look at, for example, the cost of governance in Kenya. Look at the devolution. Look at the entire architecture and the cost of governance. And I think that this is an opportunity to examine those things. But I suspect, reading from the first BBI report, that the political class once again is much more interested in amending things that will allow them to cobble political alliances.
Yeah.
And that is what we should guard against. We should ensure that if we are making amendments, we are not making those amendments to meet short-term political interests of certain elements within the political class, but using it to clean up the constitution for posterity. We must be on guard because politicians are the ones who consistently have messed up this constitutional process, consistently. And this, I must say, I've always wanted an opportunity to say, Amos Wako disappoints me because he has been present at every stage of constitution making. And it appears that he doesn't remind those with whom he sits that this was the original cause. Even right now, he's in the BBI. And I would want the BBI to benefit from the history that he has. But somehow, and I must say this, somehow, he falls short. And I've said it in my book, that if Amos Wako was a little bit more enthusiastic, because God has given him the opportunity to be the constant factor, Kenya would have had a better constitution. I do not know whether I'm being harsh to Amos, but God has given him that opportunity. And somehow
what would you like to see him do differently? Like you've said, yes, he's participated throughout the process. Now he's even involved in the BBI. He's one of the members of the BBI task force. What would you like to see Amos Wako do differently?
To remember that when we made the CKRC draft, he was there. He was a member of the CKRC, and he remembers what Kenyans told us about executive, what Kenyans told about devolution, what Kenyans told us about representation, that he remained faithful to that true north. And the question why I'm saying that he disappoints me a little is because he's the very same who was a delegate at Bomas of Kenya when the draft had been taken from Bomas, went out with another group of politicians in Kilifi, and in Kilifi they changed the original draft, and once again he was the Attorney General when we had this draft in the year 2010, and once again it was changed, and once again he's in BBI. Perhaps, let me be charitable to him, perhaps he tells them and they don't listen. Perhaps.
So let's go back actually into that acrimony of the Bomas Constitutional Conference between 2003 and 2005 and look at what was happening then. So you've alluded to the fact that after the election, some members of the political class wanted to steer clear of the journey towards a new constitution. Others had their own personal agenda, but also we had other delegates who represented other interests at Bomas. Why was it so acrimonious? Up to a point where we had a walkout.
Led by the Honorable Murungi Kiraitu.
Yes.
They said that the government actually walked out. And this is the reason why they walked out. When we were doing the constitution and we made our presentation on devolution, the delegates thought that we should re-examine it again. And we prepared a separate draft on devolution and culture. And we had something that was called a consensus group, which was headed by Bishop Sulumeti. On the day that we presented our report, Christopher Murungaru, who was then a minister in the office of the president, came with another document saying that we did not need devolution, we only needed to improve provincial administration. The delegates rejected that document. And then those who are in government said, if you can't listen to government, we are not going to participate. So they walked out. And when they walked out, we said that we were still quarried, and we continued. The religious sector was still there. The civil society was there. Institutions of higher learning were there. Elements of the political class in the opposition were still there. And therefore, despite the fact that they stayed away, we were able to continue. But what they did was to then sponsor cases in court. And one of the cases was to require that whatever came out of the Bomas of Kenya would be subjected to a referendum. Remember, at that time, it was assumed that after Bomas of Kenya, the parliament would sit as a constituent assembly and adopt the constitution without the need for a referendum because the people have given their ways, their views. So the entire element of a referendum was then ordered in a suit that was filed by the Reverend Njoya and others. And Justice Ringera ruled that a constitution could only be adopted if there is a referendum and not adoption by a parliament constituting itself into a constituent assembly.
But Prof, looking back at that moment when a section of delegates walked out and there's what you say, a majority remained in the House. But looking at the spirit of even the Bishop Sulumeti committee, which was looking at consensus building, do you think it was the right thing for you to then go ahead and call for a vote for adoption of the draft by those that were left in the House? Looking back.
It was the right thing. Remember, as I told you, the late John Njoroge Mishuki had told us, we do not need a constitution. What we wanted was to remove Moi. So you could see that this was carefully choreographed. The choreography was that if we walked away, the entire process is scuttled. But remember that the people of Kenya had spoken. So you cannot surrender to a few individuals who, for a known reason, which I must say must have been selfish, simply tried to move out so that they scuttled the process. The majority of Kenyans were there, and in any event, those who moved out were the minority. They voted with their feet, and they had their lackeys in the conference. Despite the fact that physically they had moved, it is right to say that they still had representation within the conference, and they also had representation in our own commission. They had recruited elements within our own commission. And in my book, if you read it, there was a dinner which was organized by Murungi Kiraitu for some of our commissioners, and the instruction was to torpedo the process and to pass a vote of no confidence. In fact, there was an attempt to pass a vote of no confidence on Yash Gai and myself, because they deemed that we were part of the problem in wanting the process to go on. And you have to read my book. I think it's the only book that has been written that speaks blow by blow how we went through the process. Initially released as the postponed promise, and now republished as swearing by Kenya.
I hear you say all of these, and would I be right in saying then, with the final document as it came out, and with what would hope would govern Kenyans for the future, were you satisfied with what came out? Through all of this process and all of this, the attempted scuttling in and out, were you satisfied with what came out that would serve as a document for years to come?
Commentators, both locally and abroad, have said that the draft that was generated at the Bomas of Kenya, which was a reflection of the majority of Kenyans, is one of the best draft constitutions the world has ever seen. There is no perfect constitution, but I would want you to read both academic articles and other contributions across the world. In fact, in Sweden, they have established a place where the Kenyan constitution process is showcased as the most consultative process in modern constitution making. It was a reflection of the views of the people of Kenya. And often you see politicians now saying, let us go back to the Boma draft. But as I've said, the caveat is there is no perfect constitution.
But are you satisfied with what came out?
No, thoroughly satisfied.
Why?
Because it reflected the views of the people of Kenya, and it would have improved governance. Because why do we make constitutions? Constitutions is a contract between the governors and the governed among themselves. When I say I'm satisfied, number one, because it addressed critical issues of governance. The question of an executive who is answerable to the people, a legislature that is representative of all shades of opinion, including marginalized communities and historically oppressed people like women. In the area of corruption, it dealt with the question of ethics. Historically, land was a problem. It dealt with that. It dealt with issues of independence of the judiciary. It dealt with the economy of the country in terms of devolution, ensuring that we remain a heterogeneous country, but one that is organized in a manner where resources are efficiently deployed. We only suggested 14 regions, not these ethnically pure 47 burdensome counties, which is eating our resources and undermining development. So that document was a document that reflected the views of the people of Kenya. Remember, we were only midwives. We did not create a constitution. We midwifed what Kenyans said, and a midwife is neither the father nor the mother nor the child. He simply facilitates.
If we look at, let me rephrase what I'm saying. Would I be right in suggesting that what I hear you say is that even as we celebrate 10 years of the promulgation of our constitution, there is a very slim chance that we will actually get to implement this constitution fully?
Let me be candid with you. There are certain elements within the Kenyan political class who, as long as they are alive and active in Kenyan politics, you'll always have a problem with constitutional implementation, because their interest is to have a document that addresses their short-term political interests. But history has demonstrated, not only here, that it is the vigilance of the people and critical sectors, including you, the media. It is the vigilance. Democracy is about vigilance. If the people are not vigilant, then it is in the nature of politicians to want to shortchange the people, because power concentrated in a few hands is very sweet to those fellows. So I can tell you that vigilance of the population is what will ensure proper and effective implementation of the Constitution.
How do we unshackle ourselves from this political class? Because, Prof, this is a social contract between the populace, the citizens, and the political class. Like you've said, Bombers of Kenya was people-driven. Then it was scuttled by some elements in the political class. We had the Kilifi draft. Then we had the Committee of Experts draft, which went to a political negotiation forum in Naivasha, where a number of things were also amended from the initial harmonized draft constitution. How do we, even as we say that we want to retain and maintain our vigilance, how do we overcome this?
We are not the first country to do this. If you have political will is very important. If you look at the constitutional dispensation in the neighborhood, look at the Ugandan constitution of 1995, when the NRM leadership wanted to change the constitution. Because there was political will, it was easy to change it. Look at the Ethiopian constitution of 1984, political will. Look at the Rwandese constitution, political will. But in Kenya, the problem is that one part of the Kenyan political culture is that we have too many carryovers from past regimes, and therefore their political culture has never changed. Their political DNA never changes. And the only way to do is to force their hand. And forcing their hand is making demands. And I see the religious sector doing that. When the religious sector issues this audit, that is the kind of demand that you need. When the civil society does that, when different sectors of the economy and the society apply this pressure, that is the only way in which you force political will. Political will in Kenya is not very easy to enforce, partly because of the manner in which we organize our politics, complete with low voltage ethnic warlords and kingpins. When you have politics being run on the basis of ethnic warlordism, then it is not very easy to do things that are really Kenyan. So until the day that we deal with that, and I commend to you a book written by Koigi Wawamwere, Towards Genocide in Kenya, the Curse of Negative Ethnicity, in which he says that as long as Kenyans are beholden to these political ethnic kingpins, we can never do something that is in the best interest of Kenya in its corporate sense. And you'll begin to see when the BBI comes, you'll hear Luo elders have said this, Kikuyu elders have said, Luhya elders have said, Kisii elders have said. Nobody will be talking about Kenya, very few.
Yep.
And even when they do so, they will not be heard, because even the print media has also been wedded to this ethnic jaundiced approach to handling of national affairs.
How does that change then? Because we this has been something that has been there for eternity. And if we're saying that certain things need to change, political will then needs to become something. We're saying that, ethnicity or the whole war around ethnic and tribal discussions needs to change. How does then that change?
Perhaps the word eternity that you have used is hyperbolic. But the truth is that we have only been a nation for slightly over 50 years. So it is, in terms of the life of a nation, that is very short. So I'm myself happy that you are even facilitating this kind of conversation. It is these kinds of conversation, and it is lone voices such as yours and mine who remain unpopular at these critical masses that will, in the fullness of time, begin to inform and change political processes. So don't be worried, because sometimes it sounds very lonely and it sounds quite unfruitful. But I believe that we are beginning to hear this conversation. I read a lot of writing on the BBI, those who oppose it, those who don't oppose it. But the fact that we are bringing these things on the table, the politicians are listening. Even when we irritate them, they are listening. And the beauty of the law is that it does not change those who are evil, but it restrains them. And once they are restrained and they get used to behaving well, then it forms their habits. And once the habits are properly situated and located, then it becomes their character. And when that happens, then they begin to change. So when I'm talking about the life of a nation, I'm no longer thinking about my lifetime. I'm thinking about intergenerational responsibility. And I can see Kenya is beginning to move in that direction.
Well, thank you very much, Prof, for speaking to us. As we conclude the conversation, I'd like to ask your comment on what the president said yesterday. He says, 10 years later, the moment to improve on the Constitution is now. We must not succumb to the paralysis of constitutional rigidity. What do you say to that? Is this the time?
There is merit in what he says, to the extent that we created and gave unto ourselves a constitution that had been mutilated by the political class. Perhaps now it is the time to correct those wrongs. So I agree with him to that extent. But I don't agree with the president when he says that this is a constitutional moment. That is a misuse of the word constitutional moment. I think we only have an opportunity to right the wrongs. And I accept when in correcting those wrongs, we must do it in order to secure the interest of the nation for this generation and generation yet to be born. But I once again want to reiterate, let us be vigilant. Let us watch the politicians. Let them not use this opportunity. And I suspect one of the things, and I do not know what is in the bombers of Kenya, you will possibly see an expanded executive. And the reason for the expanded executive will possibly to allow the political class to cobble together an ethnic group so that they can compete to seek ethnic votes. So you may see president, deputy president, prime minister, deputy prime minister, two deputy prime ministers, ministers drawn from parliament so that you can make promises before the election. If they bring such things, we should call them out of order and tell them we want devolution, we want reduction of things that consume money that should go into development. Vigilance, 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 because our politicians are very short-sighted, some of them.
Thank you very much, Professor P.L.O. Lumumba, former Secretary of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission. Asante sana for joining us, and we wish you a good day today as we celebrate these 10 days.
Amen.
Thank you very much.